The Genesis tree in Path of Exile Keepers of the Flame is going to be a way to craft lots of different things in the game, a new crafting system if you will, and it's a tree that has its own passive tree. And on that passive tree there's kind of different segments for doing different things. In a way it kind of reminds me of Expedition, where Expedition was able to offer lots of different things to the player all rolled into one mechanic. You've got Rog, who crafts equipment for you, Tujen to sell you currency items, and then there's Gwenon for that unique gamble. And in a way, the Genesis tree is doing a similar thing to that. You can craft equipment items if you want, like gear, weapons, rings, amulets, things like that. Or you can actually target craft specific unique items, or you can craft different currency items as well, including some specialized currency that can only come from the Genesis tree. And then there's a section, of course, just to craft grafts, which is going to be the way you actually obtain that new item in 3.27, and that's the borrowed power system for this upcoming league. I did a whole video yesterday talking about graft skills in particular because they look really interesting, so you can check that one out if you want to. Now over here on PoEDB, we actually have a list of Genesis tree modifiers on the nodes and the notables, and this is not a data mined list because, the patch isn't out yet. That will probably be data mined in the next couple of days, but this is a list that's been compiled from the reveal footage and from the Ziggy D footage and things like that. All that stuff has kind of been compiled here in a list of modifiers that actually relate to the different crafting systems there. So you've got the Graft Crafting right here, and then further down you've got Currency Crafting. This is all we know so far for the currency one. And then you've got the Equipment Crafting, which is a lot more because we've seen a lot more of those nodes, and Unique Crafting. And one thing that you'll notice immediately about these modifiers is that there is a lot of Necropolis themes going on here, but one thing that I noticed straight away is that even though it has a lot of Necropolis themes going on with the way these modifiers kind of interacting with each other, there isn't the busy work aspect there. That was kind of the real pain point of Necropolis. It was the whole collecting corpses from maps and storing corpses and then going to your graveyard and actually placing the corpses in the ground in the very specific combination to get the most efficient craft. All of that stuff was just absolutely awful in my opinion, and it looks like this system here on the Genesis tree is removing a lot of that busy work and potentially also removing some of the power, because one of the other problems with the Necropolis crafting, of course, was that it basically invalidated a bunch of the other crafting systems in the game because it was just way too powerful. And so far from what we've seen from this, it doesn't look quite as powerful. I'll get more into that in a moment. But one of the other things that we know about the Genesis tree, which was actually confirmed by GGG, is that the Genesis tree itself, the passive tree, will actually be free to respec. So you can experiment a lot with this tree. You can see here, what would it cost to respec points in the Genesis tree? Nothing. Doing so is free. So there's no gold cost, no kind of regret cost or anything like that. I thought they might do it where you have to pay graft blood to actually respec the points, but they're not doing any of that. It's completely free to experiment with, different modifiers and things like that, which I think is a really, really good thing to do. So let's discuss the power of the Genesis tree in terms of crafting. And one of the things that immediately comes to mind when it comes to equipment crafting there is the opportunity to actually obtain very early linked items, especially items that you can actually use. Because it's very often the case, you'll see a 5 link fairly early in the campaign. You might see it in, Act 5, but it's just an item that you can't use because it's on a full dexterity base and you're playing a full strength character or something like that. The Genesis tree actually has a method to obtain linked items very, very well, especially highly linked items, 5 links and 6 links. That's because it has these modifiers right here. There's a small node right here which says birth, equipment, roll sockets and links plus 10 times, keeping the best outcome. And then there's the notable there that comes after that one, birth, equipment, roll sockets and links plus 150 times, keeping the best outcome. 160 computed jeweler's orbs there. It goes through all 160 of them, and whatever the highest outcome is, it keeps that. So if it would roll a 6 socket item in those 160, it's going to keep it. Then it's going to do the same for fusings, and if it would roll a 5 link or a 6 link as the highest in those 160, it will keep that. So what you're going to see is when you actually get these two together and you start to get slightly higher level, like as soon as you reach, Act 4, Act 5, and you start to do this, you're going to very often get 5 links from this. That was showcased in the Ziggy D video because 160 rolls of fusings is just, that is a lot, right? At that stage of the game, it's ridiculous to be able to have 160 fusings or even 160 jeweler's orbs. You just don't have that. And even the crafting bench has a craft to guarantee a 5-link that is 150 fusings, so the chance to actually roll a fusing naturally is probably somewhere around 100 fusings or something like that, maybe 90. So this is going to result in 5 links very, very often, and then of course, depending on how often you can actually do the craft and actually keep trying for this, you are going to see 6 links from it as well the further you go into the game. So that is immediately a very, very powerful thing that you can do with the Genesis tree. If this type of modifier exists on the Genesis tree for equipment, then there's a lot of potential there for crafting good gear. And one thing that I want to kind of highlight here is the option there to be able to craft a good weapon. Let's say you're playing a slam build and you want a physical damage 2-handed axe. Well, there's ways that you can kind of isolate that option. You know, you can make it have a higher chance there to actually craft the weapon in the first place. Then you can make it have a higher chance to actually have a strength requirement, which, you know, is going to favor axes a little bit more there. And then, you know, you can exclude intelligence requirements if you want to, and you can have a higher chance here to actually make it a 2-handed weapon rather than a 1-handed weapon. And then you have 400% increased chance for physical modifiers. Well, here's the problem with that node there. Even though it's going to make it a lot higher likelihood that you actually get those physical modifiers, the problem is the weighting of the modifiers. You can actually have a look here that, you know, we have 3 physical modifiers on the prefixes, and there's some physical modifiers on the suffixes there that you probably don't want. But the problem is actually getting those high tier modifiers, because the higher level those modifiers get, the lower weight they get. You can see here that these modifiers up here, 1000 weight each, but the highest tier modifier, 25 weight. This is why that isolating the modifier rating of Necropolis was so powerful, because it was able to actually make those higher level modifiers have a higher weighting relative to what else is there available in the pool. And so if you're not able to actually exclude specific modifiers from the pool, you're very often going to end up with an item that has the correct modifiers on it, but they're not very high tier modifiers, so they're not something that you're actually looking for. So we'll have to wait and see exactly what's going to go on there, but obviously there are going to be ways to actually obtain good items with this tree. For example, you can influence the tree to actually craft boots that then have a specific attribute that then also roll movement speed, and you can make it so that there's a reduced chance for elemental modifiers here. For example, 80% reduced chance for fire, lightning, and cold, which means that if you're crafting a dexterity pair of boots, then the suffix may have a higher chance to roll spell suppression, for example. So there are ways that you're going to be able to influence this to actually craft very powerful items, but just based on what we've seen so far, it doesn't look like it's going to be as powerful as Necropolis grave crafting, which I think is actually a very good thing. Now, one of the other parts of the Genesis tree is actually the unique crafting, which is another kind of subsection of the tree. I believe that the points are not shared between the trees. I may be wrong on that, but this is a different tree in and of itself, and this one actually allows you to craft unique items, and then you can do a kind of similar thing where you're targeting specific unique items. And one thing that I think is going to be really powerful about this is target farming specific uniques at a specific item level, because we know that you're going to have an input item that you actually put into the tree, and that input item has an item level on it. So anything of that item level and lower can actually be crafted. Let's say it's a level 30 item, well, that's not going to be able to be a Mage Blood because it's not high enough eye level. And that means that you're going to be able to potentially target farm specific low-level uniques. For example, let's say you're playing through the campaign and you want to get a Cloak of Flame. Well, that's a level 18 item there, and it's pure int, and it's also a body armor. So you can go over to the Genesis tree here and you can see, you know, 1000% increased chance for birth unique items to be a body armor, and then you have 300% increased chance for intelligence requirements. And then the actual item that you input there could be, let's say it's a level 20, item level 20, which means that it can't give you anything above item level 20. And that's going to massively slim down the pool of items that it can actually give you. And then even beyond that, you can kind of combine this with trying to get, you know, rarer unique items, because there's this one here, which is birthed uniques are rolled an additional time, keeping the rarest outcome. Now, what that means is that it's essentially lucky for unique rolls. When the unique actually gets crafted and dropped onto the ground right there, it's going to roll the item an additional time. So you're essentially getting 2 rolls there, and whichever has the rarest outcome is going to be the item that's actually obtained. And then you could even combine that with this one here, and when that actually procs, both of those items are going to roll an additional time, so you essentially get 4 rolls, and you're going to get the 2 rarest outcomes of those 4 rolls. And you can kind of roll all of this in together. For example, Ralakesh Impatience are a very rare pair of boots. I believe they're a tier 1 unique. But once again, this is a level 36 item. And you can do a similar thing there where you kind of isolate the attributes, which is strength in. And you can isolate it being a pair of boots. So, you can choose this one here and you can do strength and in. And then you can do this one to try and get a rarer outcome. And one thing that I do want to note about the unique thing is obviously later on into the game, a lot of people are going to be going for Foulborn unique items, which is this new reward that's coming into the game in 3.27. Foulborn uniques are essentially a unique where a modifier has been removed and a new one has been put on there. And these are not random, they actually have been created by GGG, and I think they said there's going to be at least 100 of them, so not that many in terms of the overall pool of uniques. There's a lot of unique items in Path of Exile. 100 is actually not that many. And they already specified that some of the boss items will not be obtainable as Foulborn items, which doesn't include the Breach ones, because some of the Breach items are actually going to come specifically from the tree. We've already seen a few of those in the reveal. But when it comes to Foulborn items, the interesting thing is going to be, we're likely to get a data mine on which ones are good, and then obviously as the league progresses, you're going to have people actually target farming the specific ones which are either valuable in Trade League, or in SSF they'll be target farming the one that they actually want to use in their build. But this one here is really interesting. Foulborn unique items have a 20% chance of multiple Foulborn modifiers. The crazy thing here is, we know that there's not going to be that many Foulborn items, so how many of that subset are actually going to have 2 Foulborn modifiers? You might actually find that you're able to target farm Foulborn items with 2 modifiers really, really well, because there's just not many of them at all. So obviously, to actually get this, you need to hit the double roll, and that is only if there can be a Foulborn item in that case. Then you actually need to hit the 20%, so this is not going to happen all that often. But if there's, a particular Foulborn you want to go for that has 2 modifiers and there's nothing else that can be rolled in that subsection of items with, particular requirements and a particular equipment type and things like that, you may find that you can actually target farm these quite well if you get lucky and actually roll that outcome. Now, one of the other parts of the Genesis tree is the currency, which is the one we kind of have the least information about. It kind of looked like this is going to be able to give you some extra basic currency here and there. Of course, we're going to see the Reddit posts of people getting a bunch of divines from this, I'm sure, or a mirror or things like that. But overall, this kind of part of the tree looks probably the least interesting to me, at least. There are some things that you're going to be able to do with this. There are new currency items that only come from this part of the tree. For example, there are currency items that actually only interact with the grafts. The grafts, you won't actually be able to craft them with normal currency items. You will have to use ones from the tree. And therefore, this is always going to be a useful section of the tree to actually interact with, because those currency items presumably are going to be quite useful, especially into the end game where people really want to min-max their gear. So there's always going to be that use case for the currency part of the Genesis tree there, but there's also another type of currency item that is brand new in this patch, and they're kind of similar to the greater or perfect currencies from PoE 2, although they have different wording and meaning. Because even though they look very similar, they don't work the same way. So the ones in PoE 2, the greater and perfect currency items, they actually say that you can't get a modifier under this specific level. Whereas in Path of Exile 1, these new currency items are basically saying that there's a higher chance to receive higher level modifiers. So they essentially work more like fossils do in PoE 1, where, they'll say a particular tag has a higher chance and therefore it has a higher weighting relative to everything else. That's basically what's going to happen. It's going to pump up the weighting of these higher tier modifiers. We don't know by how much, but it's going to make it more likely for you to get higher tier modifiers. And then for the graft crafting, we don't know just yet exactly what grafts are going to be able to roll in terms of the modifiers and things like that, but this is going to be a way to be able to exclude those modifiers, so you can get generally higher quality grafts overall. And speaking of quality, there's the other kind of terminology there for quality in Path of Exile, which is the quality on items. And this notable here gives quality on the graft. And I kind of took this existing as we can't put quality on a graft in any other way. I mean, maybe there's a currency item to do that comes from the tree. But this is going to give grafts a random amount of quality when they're actually crafted. And quality as a stat on grafts makes it so that you can actually obtain more Graft's blood and store more Graft's blood before you actually have to go back to the tree. Now, one of the other things on the graft tree is chance for womb gifts to birth an additional graft, and this actually goes way over 100%. So I'm not sure what's going on here. Usually with this type of modifier in Path of Exile, going over 100% wouldn't actually do anything, but in this case it might be possible to actually craft 3 grafts at once, or even 4, depending on how much of this is actually available on the tree, but we're not sure of that just yet. I would say that it's likely that these are just positioned in different places of the tree, and that's why there's several of them here. You're not really expected to get all of them all at once, so that's probably what's going on, and it actually does cap out 100%. But overall, the Genesis tree, it looks so much better than Necropolis grave crafting, so, you know, that's a great thing, and I'm looking forward to interacting with it in the upcoming patch. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.